Hello, everyone. Happy to have you today and incredibly honored and pleased to be joined by Bob Kealing. Bob is the author of the book Good Day, Sunshine State, How the Beatles Rocked Florida. Bob, how you doing today?
I'm wonderful, Matthew. It's great to be with you.
Great to be talking to you. So, your book is incredibly focused on a particular time in the history of the Beatles as a band, but an incredibly important time about the band. And we're going to talk about the book in just a second. But before we do that, I want to talk about you. And if you could describe your connection to the band, it's obviously such an important part of global pop culture. How would you say you came into your familiarity with the Beatles, your fandom, I'm assuming, with the Beatles, if you're writing a
Yeah.
whole darn book? What's your personal connection to the band?
I think in that sense, I kind of won the DNA lottery because I was the youngest of six children. I am. And my oldest sister had all the original Beatles vinyl. Okay. So while everybody else I was very young at the time, but still everybody else in my age group might have been listening to more kind of bubblegum pop acts. I was listening to Revolver, Hard Day's Night, Help. I'm from a very young age, and I think I share the opinion of a lot of people that the music still sounds so fresh today. It's still so evocative today of a time and place, and I think that's indicative that it's great timeless music because it just keeps being discovered by ensuing generations. So, that's my story. I've been a fan. I've seen the Beatles solo several times, and as recently as Paul at Camping World Stadium in Orlando last May, and it was just magnificent.
That's great. And he was actually just in he heck, he might still be in Florida. I know Paul was here as of like 2 weeks ago for an event in Miami. So even after these decades since their first arrival here, Florida still has a certain charm. So being a fan of the Beatles is one thing. Deciding to write a book about this particular chapter of their history is a whole different level of commitment. What pulled you into writing this book? You've written books before. Why did this book kind of jump out to you?
Well, my raison d'etre has always been finding pre-Disney history in Florida, because especially where I am in just north of Orlando, people think that nothing happened before Walt Disney came to town. And given the fact that I'm a Beatles fan, and when I started researching it, I realized the Beatles spent more time in Florida than anywhere else in North America during this watershed year, 1964. So this book is not at all a stretch. There's over 200 pages of narrative. And what I like to see it as is three different sections. You've got innocence, influence, and then their earliest activism in the United States. All happened in the pot boiler that was 1964 Florida. There was a lot going on.
So how do you decide? Like you said, this is someone from the outside that's not familiar with the history here might say, "Wow, just this small chunk of time." But in reality, there is so much richness that we'll talk about in just a little bit. What's the process to jump into this as an author? What challenges arose in this book compared to other works, and specifically, if you could kind of walk people through how does someone get through the process of getting this to a finished product?
What I like to do is follow the timeline. I do like to do it sequentially, at least in the research. And I was very fortunate to have a number of primary sources agree to speak with me. And this book has over 30 original primary source interviews. So this isn't something aggregated off Google or something. I had access to Beatle letters, artwork, photographs from the Hard Rock collection. I went through the Flagler College Civil Rights collection, which was critical on the end of my research for the last section, which was their first activism in America, which was in Northeast Florida, Jacksonville. And you'd be amazed how many people are open and friendly, especially people of advanced age who may tend to think that, yeah, my time has come and gone, and maybe people aren't as interested anymore. And like for instance, when I sent an email to John Lowengard. Now, that name may not mean anything. He was the Life magazine photographer who took the picture of the Beatles bobbing heads in the pool on Biscayne Bay, which became an iconic picture of them. Sent him an email, and within a very short period of time, he's like, "Yeah, sure. How can I help?" And those sources lead you to other sources like Gail Cameron, who was the reporter for Life, who convinced the Beatles to get into that cold swimming pool, even though they were thinking they were going to have more of a holiday than having to work. And she had a great line. She was at the Deauville and she's, please, John, could you just, I know you're supposed to be having some time off, but this would be big for us. And he's finally, okay, love, we'll do it. And to me, moments like that are gold. So it's really just sincerity, and it's doing the digging, finding the people, approaching them. And I've been a journalist in Florida for over 30 years, so that probably doesn't hurt either.
It helps to build relationships. Yeah, I can,
Mhm.
we work in different media, but that's something in doing this podcast that I've been amazed by, that I don't think I've heard no once. When I've asked to reach out to someone to talk about something, I'm like, why are you talking to, like, I mean, this being one example of many, but just folks, when you have an interesting story and when something's good, people want to talk about it, and as an author, I know, like, you have to have a nose for what's good. You have to have a nose for not writing 100 pages and realizing it isn't a good story. You have to kind of figure that out before you put the work in, and you've certainly done that here.
Yeah, and I think with several of these sources, they've since passed away. Several of them. Loengard being one, Gail Cameron being another, Reggie Young of the legendary Memphis Boys, the studio musician. He was part of Bill Black's combo that opened for the Beatles. And I wonder if these folks have a sense that mortality's catching up with them and they want to share their story. And I'm just thrilled to have those stories be part of the book because they're original. These are folks who were very close to the Beatles. Another South Florida icon was Larry Kane, the radio man who was 21 years old, and we spent hours talking about his story and how he kind of fell into being invited to go along on both of the first two tours for the Beatles in North America in '64 and '65. So that was a thrill.
That's great. So the Beatles arrive in 1964 in the United States, and obviously the celebrated first performance on the Ed Sullivan Show is such a really a changing of the guard almost in pop culture. But it kicks off this incredibly important 1964 year, and the Beatles make two. Correct me if I'm wrong, because please at any point correct me. But I believe there are two formal performances in Florida. There's the second performance on Ed Sullivan, and then the concert in Jacksonville.
Mhm.
So we're gonna come back to Jacksonville because, as you alluded
Sure.
to, that's kind of the back half of this really important development. But arriving in Miami and spending time in South Florida, um, we talked about the performance in the Deauville. Um, that week that they spent here, uh, how does that change them? How does that their time here in South Florida help them move along as a band?
Well, I think plain and simply, they fell in love with America in Miami and Miami Beach. Because remember, when they were their first show at the Ed Sullivan Theater, they're basically prisoners at the hotel. And yes, they do get out a little bit by train to go to DC to do a show. And, they did Carnegie Hall. But in terms of actually getting down to sunny Florida, seeing the beaches, Paul McCartney talked about, we'd never seen palm trees and much less beautifully tanned young women. And, so in terms of you know, eh, having their triumph, Paul had said, we didn't want to try to tour America until we had our number one song. And that was, I Want to Hold Your Hand. That was really important for them. So these were just like one goal after another being realized. They were on top of the world here. And interviewing Ed Sullivan's grandson, he said, there was much more of a vibe in Miami with the Beatles. They're at this working resort. You imagine part of your job is, oh yeah, they're going to stage this satellite Ed Sullivan show in 1964 from our ballroom, and there's people everywhere, and the generator is being taxed to its absolute limit because of all the lighting and all of that. So to me, it was just this second performance is so much more landmark in the sense that it was more real. They were in America. They had their first home cooked meal at their bodyguard's house in North Miami Beach in his tiny little policeman's house. And that had some really interesting connections in and of itself. But in terms of the band's progression, I think this was more of them finally seeing success. You know, they'd been through Hamburg and played thousands of hours on the Reeperbahn, this awful, red light district type place. And now all of a sudden you're at this swanky hotel in America. They've got women throwing themselves at them. And, for
Hmm.
young English guys, pasty skinned who'd never really seen a beach, this was real success for them. South Florida was where they fell in love with America.
You mentioned this, and it's probably my favorite chapter of the whole uh story of the Beatles in South Florida. But so I'm going to ask you to don't give away all the goodies, because again, we want people to buy the book Good Day Sunshine
I'm
State.
good at teases. Yes, I'm very good
Yes.
at teases.
I,
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about the Buddy Dresner corner of this story, because Buddy Dresner is one of my favorite of we've done almost 2 years worth of shows, so that's probably about 25 episodes at this point. He might be one of my favorite characters that I've ever talked about on this show, because he talk about a fish out of water and just being such an important character in such a big story. Can
Oh,
you
yeah.
give us a good corner of the Buddy Dresner story?
Oh, absolutely. This guy was the night shift sergeant for the Miami Beach Police Department. He didn't know what the hell the Beatles were. And some guy comes knocking on his door after he's done the night shift and he's trying to sleep by day like a vampire. And he gets woken up by another cop and he is PO'd. And they're like, "Hey, you got to come. The captain wants to talk to you." And he's like, "What the hell for?" And all of that. And so, to make a long story short, when they told him he was going to be the bodyguard for the Beatles, he's like, "What is Beatles? What are you talking about?" So you think, okay, this is going to be some stern, inflexible guy that's going to butt heads with the Beatles, especially with a guy like John Lennon, who wasn't real big on authority. But it wasn't that way at all, because Buddy Dresner had this great way about him. And I owe a major debt of gratitude to Buddy's son, Barry, who gave me access to hours of a videotaped interview he did with his dad. So again, here's another just priceless primary source of being like the father figure, the uncle, the big brother, the friend. At one point he roomed with George. So these guys really developed a kinship for each other and a friendship that lasted for decades after he protected them there in Miami Beach. And I'll tell you this, Matthew, if there were no Buddy Dresner, there would be no book. He's that important.
Yeah, I it's why I knew I could bring him up, and it would not spoil the fun, because that's again, like I said, I've talked about a number of names in South Florida over the last 2 years, and that's the one that always sticks in my mind. Like, what a great little part of a big story, but but someone who enters the story as such just a regular guy, a regular Joe, and becomes
Mhm.
really central to this whole thing working out right. It's really fantastic. So if only for that, buy the book, because I'm looking forward to reading the Buddy Dresner sections of the book for
Oh
sure.
yeah. He was great, and he just was so adept at being able to deal with celebrities and not be starstruck. At one point, he's sitting across the table from Elvis, and he's talking about the Beatles and what he did with them when he was protecting them. Um, and it's interesting too to talk to folks who knew Buddy. And I interviewed several who did, and including one very interesting cameo, one very notable person who grew up as the Dresner's neighbor, and they all loved him. He was just a beloved figure, and he's so special, and it means a lot to tell his story, and that's why I dedicated the book to him.
That's wonderful. That's great. So the Beatles come to America in 1964, and they are a signal of change, but there are other forces of change afoot. You have a nation that's still reeling from the assassination of a president. You have a civil rights movement coming into its greatest point of influence with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And as you allude to, the Beatles go from these observers of American culture into the shapers of American culture in this time. How does their experience in Florida move them from this point of again nascent stardom into influential advocacy stardom.
Yeah, they really did evolve from these innocents coming here, oh, beaches, palm trees, to being, as you said, cultural agents of change. And way back in the spring when they first came up with, when Brian Epstein is taking bookings for their first what was going to be a behemoth tour, you see right on their rider, number 6 clause, the Beatles will not be obligated to play in front of segregated audiences. And that was a big, risky stand in the South. And I don't think people quite understand that Florida was right in the middle of it. I mean, this state was a real potboiler, and you had people like Cassius Clay and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson, all of these notable people coming through the state. And you can't tell the story of the Beatles in 1964 Florida shining a light on the African American experience. And I was certainly glad to do that and see how they really were treated like second class citizens. And the Beatles were not going to put up with that. And thank goodness for the likes of Larry Kane asking them, really probing their developing worldview where they said, Paul, who's supposed to be, the winking happy guy and all that. No, I mean, he cut right to the chase and said, we don't get it. We're not used to being have any called colored people, which was an acceptable term back then. We're not used to them being treated as like animals or something. I have no problem with them. I wouldn't have a problem with them sitting next to me. This is 21-year-old Paul. And they all were like that. And they all were like, yeah, if you're going to segregate it, we're not going to play here. But I think one thing the book does is sort of finally piece together why segregation didn't turn out to be an issue at the Gator Bowl. And you have to read all of the steps that happen with this remarkable federal judge, Brian Simpson, who was up in Jacksonville, and he was a Truman appointee, and finally threw the hammer down and, at one point took testimony in court from Dr. King. And one of the things I'm really proud of is to draw this nexus philosophically and physically between the Beatles and Martin Luther King. At one point, just weeks apart, they were next door to each other on this little street in Jacksonville where some amazing history happened thanks largely to this judge. And now the big shining new federal courthouse in downtown Jacksonville is named after this guy, and in the book you'll find out why.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Jacksonville in particular is, like you said, Florida is this powder keg or boiling pot in the civil rights movement. And Jacksonville itself is really a maelstrom within the maelstrom in terms of the conflict over civil rights. And there's the famous example of a hotel pool, a hotel manager pouring muriatic acid into a pool when African Americans are attempting to swim in it. You have all these very ugly moments, but in contrast, which thankfully we see this desegregated performance of the Beatles in the Gator Bowl is really a highlight. How important do you think it is the fact that not only in terms of uh, obviously nationality but culture, the fact that the Beatles are really, I mean, I may be going on a bit of a limb, but the first biggest, let's put it that way, and say, I don't want to say the first because someone will point out, an actor or something from the 30s, but the first biggest pop cultural sensation from outside the United States to break in this way. The fact that they were not from here, they were not accustomed to our culture, they had their own culture, and they're coming here. The fact that they are so fish out of water, how much do you think that allows them to look at the big picture and say no?
Yeah, I think it definitely entitled them to do that because remember, back in the day, African American artists often went to Europe for better treatment, the jazz artists especially. And it's kind of odd how these artists would go overseas, find success, and then come back to the United States as these big sensations, that maybe they didn't get the opportunities there in the first place, and that's why they went to Europe. But yeah, you talked about that incident with the pool. That was the Monson Motor Lodge in St. Augustine, where Dr. King was arrested, and that was the first of his couple of nights in jail. One was in St. Johns County, but the other that's less known was they put him back in the back of a police car with a police dog that was looking rather bewildered. It really didn't look menacing. And I have a picture of Dr. King next to this dog in the book, and he was driven all the way to Jacksonville and held in solitary confinement for his own good. But to think this was Time Magazine's Man of the Year that was being treated like this. This was months after I Have a Dream. And to have this convergence of the Beatles and Dr. King in Florida, I think really spotlights how important the Sunshine State was to civil rights. You know, when you hear that discussion, you think rightfully so of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, et cetera. But Florida's right in there. And I hope that this gives some context to, what people were putting on the line, and the level of violence was really scary for these people who were nonviolent.
Yeah.
And that didn't matter to some folks. And it was a scary time for them, but they stood up for what they believed.
And thank goodness they did. So the Beatles come through Florida in 1964. They make their performances, they live the life. That fantastic photo of them behind you in the waters off of Miami Beach. Um, and then they depart. But obviously their influence here continues. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how much the Beatles' presence in Florida influences Florida's music scene, because I think that that's something you touch on in the book, and
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about before. It sticks. It really sticks. Maybe more than anywhere else. It really
Yeah.
sticks.
Well, in Florida was lucky, and I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder because I think Florida gets short shrift in terms of really being the state where in the United States, I mean, the guitar greats, the likes of Dwayne Allman, for instance. And a lot of that culture was developed because number one, Elvis came through like Johnny Appleseed. In 56, his big breakout year, he played more concerts in Florida than anywhere else in the United States. And then here come the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And yeah, one chapter is all about their influence in this uncommonly musical stretch of 50 to 100 miles between Gainesville and Jacksonville. And Tom Petty, he just said it was like everything went from black and white to color watching them on Ed Sullivan, and he knew what he wanted to do. And I was fortunate to interview a number of other musicians who are still with us, like Tom Ledden, who was Petty's first lead guitarist in several garage bands and in the group Mudcrutch. And then Mike Campbell comes along, and the rest is history. But you have guys like Stephen Stills and the guys from Leonard Skinner, including Ronnie Van Zant, who were so profoundly moved by the British invasion. And you just have this whole fraternity of Dwayne and Greg Allman, certainly. This whole fraternity of rock and roll greats really were profoundly moved and inspired by the Beatles coming to America and having such great success, and the importance of people like Petty seeing that you could be a collective. Okay, you could write your own songs. In America, that was pretty revolutionary. Buddy Holly and the Crickets did it to some degree, but other than that, this was brand new. And Petty's like, oh, maybe I don't have to look like Elvis. Maybe our group is going to look more like the Stones, you know what I mean? In the Beatles, but to have a collective that writes their own songs was revolutionary.
So we've talked a little bit about the legacy of the Beatles' visit in their history, and now a little bit about the musical legacy that's left behind. I want to close with this question. So the Beatles influence pop music through today. Like it's the big bang of modern pop, basically. Their arrival. And as you alluded to musically, their impact is particularly acute here, where it's really noticeable. You look at the Beatles through the lens of Florida in this book. I'm wondering if we can kind of turn the lens around for a second and tell me, what can we learn about Florida through the lens of the Beatles?
I think they come here as these innocents in February of 64, and they see all of the things that we take for granted. Number one, the palm trees, the wonderful weather, the beaches. But by the same token, I think we as a population need to do a better job of celebrating our own. We have so many trailblazing rock and rollers who were influenced by the Beatles, who are now all in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And there should be some sort of musical heritage tour, whether it be physical or whether it just be online, to celebrate all of these people who were profoundly moved by the Beatles. Um, I think overall, the nation, the world tends to gloss over Florida as a cultural place, a place that contributed to our collective history because of all of these distractions, because it's a tourist zone, because of these ridiculous stories about Florida man all the
Mm.
time that tempts people just not to take us seriously. And Florida has an amazingly rich and diverse music history, all sorts of different genres. And I would just hope that by showing what Florida meant to the Beatles, um, perhaps others can see and take seriously Florida's musical legacy, because it is very deep and very rich. And it was an absolute joy to write this book.
Well, Bob, it sounds like you've given yourself your next project in our conversation, the new curator of Florida's musical heritage trail. I think that you can get started on that when you're done with the promo tour for this book. But that sounds fantastic. I mean, it really sounds great. So, Bob Kealing, the author of Good Day, Sunshine State, How the Beatles Rocked Florida. Bob, again, I cannot thank you enough for your time and your work and your commitment to the history of our state. It's really fantastic.
Absolutely, Matthew. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.